Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. And we are taking another look at 20th Century Boys. Here on the cover of Volume 7, we see our old buddy Maro and, of course, the man he's working for, Haru Namio. And these characters are kind of important to this volume. We really got a solid introduction to them in the last volume. I talked actually quite a bit about Maro and Namio's first appearance post time skip in that last video that I did. So if you really want to know more about the status quo with them, for the most part, I talk about it there. They are kind of important here. We're going to talk about it when it comes up. In the meantime, let's jump right into it. Now, a reminder, in my last video, I talked a lot about the reveal of Friend's identity, and I made it clear that I don't intend to name drop him again. I already discussed most of what I think about him in the last video, and we're going to keep looking at him going forward, but I'm not going to use his name again in any of these videos, just to avoid spoilers in case somebody watches them out of order. So that said, there is a spoiler we do have to talk about, which is the fact that Friend died. He was shot and he was killed by Dr. Yamane at the end of the last volume. And everything that we discuss going forward here hinges on that fact. I also said in my last video that up until his death, our friend was treated in much the same way the Emperor of Japan was treated in the past. He rarely made public appearances, only a select few were worthy to be in his presence, and he typically wore a mask when he did go out, even to speak to his inner circle. This is very similar to the way the Emperor was treated in historical Japan, and this means that Friend is essentially, at least in the eyes of the FDP and his inner circle, a divine figure. He is not just a man. He's not just the most influential man in Japan. He did not just contribute supposedly to saving the world on Bloody New Year's Eve. He is a divinity. And going forward, we are going to see a lot of what that means for the world play out. That said, what we actually start off with is something much smaller and more intimate. Some of this continues to discuss our friend by name. The main cast has really just figured out who he is, and they are adapting to this. Really, for the first chapter, it's just our main characters adapting to the identity of our friend. And again, this is a necessary beat. It gives characters a moment to come to grips with a major emotional shock. We've always known that Friend was somebody they've known since childhood, but it was something that, when it was finally revealed, was going to be difficult for them to deal with. That much was obvious. So we get a little bit of time for that. Not a lot, because this is an emergency situation, but we get a little bit of time for that, and that's important. It keeps these characters human and grounded, to see them in shock, to see them dealing with this shock a little bit, and it's a very nice chapter. It also establishes that Maro and Kana do join up. They had met briefly in the school courtyard at the end of the last volume, and they have enough memories of each other that they are able to place each other after a short moment of thinking. All in all, this is kind of a nice moment. The chapter ends on them trying to get into the school building because they were never quite able to from the courtyard. But on their way in, they run into Acho coming out. They mention our friend by name here, so I'm just covering it with my hand. But Acho's coming out, and the two of them meet up. And that's the end of that chapter. And then we get the reactions of the FDP to the news that Friend is dead. It starts, interestingly enough, with this weird drug-fueled vision that Menjome has. And he's always been the man at the center of it. We're going to learn a little bit more about how he's at the center of it going forward. But for the most part, what you need to know is that Menjome has been doing drugs. We see here, got cocaine spread out before him. And he sees this vision of our friend walking away from him, which is kind of a premonition of Friend's death. And then immediately right after that, he is notified. Probably the most unrealistic sequence of this is the news. The news, of course, reports on Friend's injury and shooting and death. And there's very favorable reporting on it, and favorable to Friend himself. They speak very highly of him. There's a lot of outpourings of condolences from political leaders. that part is pretty understandable. But there's also a lot of personal investment that we see from the news anchors. Of course, we see that a lot now. And I suppose this story does technically take place in 2015 when that kind of thing was not uncommon. Um, I don't know if that's prescience on Kurosawa's part. I think it's more intended to show us our friend's charisma, his sway on the world, and many parts of this story are built around that idea. As we see the FTP going through and reacting to this, we also get a really nice moment when everybody meets up at Yoshitsune's base. Um, Kana goes there and she brings Maro with them, and Acho's with them, and they are back together. The gang's almost all here. We see Yoshitsune, and he's so overjoyed he's actually crying there to see all his friends alive again, and that's very understandable because he thought they were probably dead for at least 15 years. Well, maybe 14 years because he did find out about Acho in 2014. So this is a good moment here for our heroes, as well as a pretty bad moment for the villains. But it's still in the middle of the story, and it's not always going to be going uphill for our heroes. Um, our friend had a plan for this, and we see all of his people get together around a round table. That's the name of this chapter, round table, to discuss what they're going to do. There's 12 chairs here. I don't know if that's a direct reference to the round table. I'm afraid my Arthurian lore is not as good as it should be. But it's certainly going off the idea that our friend is a god. This is clearly a Christ reference. There are 12 seats at the table here for the 12 disciples. Now, since one of those seats belongs to Yamane, a traitor, it is, of course, empty. And it's going to have to be filled. And there's a bit here that I'm going to get to in just a second. But right now we are seeing the inner circle of the FDP fracturing. They've lost their charismatic leader. They're not quite sure what to do yet. And Manjome, of course, is in favor of going forward, which is surprising since he's always seemed like a very cynical, heavy-handed man that does what he does just to get power. But as we see in this flashback, excuse me, not the flashback, as we see in his hallucination, and again in a flashback later, he is actually tied to Friend because he was a true believer. And much of what we've seen is not necessarily his contempt for the FDP as a movement that follows Friend, but his contempt for the people in the FDP. They aren't Friend, and that seems to be the only person in the world he really respects. So surprisingly, Manjome turns out to be a true believer. And there are several people who want to abandon the plan. There are some people who are talking about the successor. These all turn out to be people that we have seen in the past. A couple of the background characters, I actually had to go back and look up again, even though I have just read all of this year. I had forgotten some of these people. I'm not going to bother to name them because really the only important ones are Shikishima's daughter, who went missing in the beginning, her husband, the guy who recruited her into the Friends, the detective who killed Cho-san, and the rest of them are just business leaders or other background characters that we have seen in certain shots, but aren't really that important going forward. And of course, as they are debating what to do next, a familiar face appears. The killer, we've been following him since the very beginning. And of course, his designation in prison, where Acho was prisoner number 3, this, of course, is prisoner number 13. That number was not an accident, and it was only partially chosen as bad luck. He's about to become the 13th disciple. He fills Yamane's seat, and unsurprisingly, shortly after this, there is a purge of the inner members. All the dissenters are cleaned up, beginning with this rather grisly accident where an entire construction truck just turns over and magically quashes a car that had some dissenters in it. And the rest of this is just the playing out of our friend's plan. Our friend left behind instructions that if he did die, there was to be no celebrations, or no memorial services funded by public money, open to the public, nothing like that. Everything was to be kept very quiet and close to the vest. And it was his belief that this would result in a spontaneous outpouring of affection for our friend after his death. And by and large, he's correct. Just like the death of Princess Di or other very popular political and cultural figures, our friend gets a lot of support, which is not surprising because remember, most people think that he is responsible for creating the vaccine that saved the world from Bloody New Year's Eve. And he actually is responsible for creating that vaccine. He's just also responsible for the creation of these. Anyway, the next couple of chapters basically just lay out a new status quo that is going to break down very quickly. Acho is the first one to leave because he knows something is still going on. He doesn't know what it is, but he's going to find out, so he leaves. But before he leaves, he tells Kana a little bit more about her mother. We're not sure how Acho learns this. My assumption is he heard it from Dr. Yamane at the school building before they went their separate ways. And it's just a brief story, but a very poignant one. And it kind of tells us how people get caught up in a cult like the FDP. We begin by seeing Kiriko and Yamane talking. This is in 2003, about the time that Kana recorded the videos that we saw when she was visiting seaside town where this hospital is located. And she talks to Yamane about, the research they've been doing. And it turns out that basically Kiriko and Yamane have been kind of playing a game. I know that sounds really weird, but it's essentially a competition to see who's the better epidemiologist or genetic engineer, or I'm not, they never say exactly. I don't think they say exactly what their degrees are in, but basically Yamane has been creating these viruses, and Kiriko turns around and makes vaccines for them, and that's basically how this kind of research takes place in real life. People look at diseases and then they make vaccines for them, and they say, well, how could this disease mutate, and can we make a vaccine for that? There's a term for that I'm not going to say because YouTube doesn't like it very much right now. Suffice it to say that this is a little bit too close to reality to be quite comfortable these days sometimes. But Kiriko tells Yamane that, it's very strange that they've been doing all this time and they've never thought about what could happen to it. Clearly, Kiriko has after Bloody New Year's Eve and her brother's death. And she raises, the really important questions. How did Kenji supposedly get this virus out of a locked up laboratory? Isn't it awfully convenient that he got a strain they already had a vaccine for? Why does friend want to stop the research after the latest iteration of the virus? And so on and so forth. And during this whole confrontation, Kiriko keeps telling Yamane he needs to go out and see the world. And symbolically, this is represented by the fact that Yamane keeps the curtains to his laboratory closed. And she tells him, you need to open them up. You need to see the world. And he says, I do my research better by artificial light. And it's the same, all day long. And I can just work as much as I want. He's been in his lab for the last 2 months. This is the first time he's been out in quite a while. And the fact of the matter is, Yamane is out of touch. He's always wanted to just be a researcher. And he didn't really buy into the FDP's line, which I think is why he was the first one to crack. He just wanted to research, and he thought that because knowing more is better, as long as he just did his research, the world would become a better place. And that's a very naive viewpoint, but I have a hard time blaming him for it because a lot of people have been raised with those kind of naive notions, never challenged. And you kind of feel a little bit bad for Yamane. He was creating terrible things. He always thought he was doing it in the service of readying people for what was to come. He never thought about the consequences of his actions. He never opened the curtains. He never saw the world. And at the end of this sequence, we see him open the curtains and look out. And this is really all we need to know to understand how Yamane got to where he was at the end of the last volume when he shot our friend. And I like this because it really humanizes the FDP, and it tells us a lot of these people have their own hangups that were exploited by Friend in order to get them to go along with him. Kiriko also seems to have been one of these people. More on that as we get more of her story, and we will. But right now, that leaves us on the promise that the Holy Mother is coming back, and she is going to bring a potential solution. She's fighting in her own way, and Acho leaves Kana with that message to take heart from, and the warning that the real fight has just started because the Friends are going to wipe out the human race. And from there, we have the build up to the climax of the second act. And it's a very interesting one. We begin with a flashback to Kenji when he's in his college days. He's playing with his band. And we had always heard that Kenji's band broke up because their drummer left. And this is that story. Their drummer is this guy here with the shades and the bandana, a very square jaw. And he gets a chance to go with another band that is doing very well in Battle of the Bands. And he's going to leave Kenji's band and sign up with that band full time. He had been filling in for their drummer because their last drummer quit. And they figured this sound is the best they can get. Kenji's band isn't doing well, and this other band, it is. What are they called again? Mars something or another. Mars Naito and the Bravos. Really, really kind of lame-sounding band name. And this band apparently doesn't come to anything. But this flashback then builds directly into Maro and company going to talk to Harunamio. Well, Yoshitsune has an underground network with a lot of resources and the ability to react very quickly to surprising situations. Maro has a mole, an actual mole, someone deep in the FDP with a lot of intelligence they can draw on, and they're kind of bringing these threads together. Each of Kenji's friends went out from Bloody New Year's Eve, and they went from being lackeys that just followed Kenji around to people who were proactively working to fulfill Kenji's goals and dreams. He could no longer do it himself. And playing into that theme, we get the final reveal. Harunamio was Kenji's drummer. And this is important for a couple of reasons. First of all, it explains why Harunamio was so willing to help Maro out. And also, it shows us that Kenji continues to have an influence that draws other people to him and binds them to his sense of right and wrong after he grows up, because Kenji meets Haru as an adult. I don't remember if I talked about this too much when I discussed them previously, so if I'm repeating myself, I apologize. But this is a really important way of developing Kenji as a character, because we knew he was a very charismatic leader as a young man, and we know that as an adult at 37, he had to revive those skills, those abilities, that charisma that allowed him to bind people to him and make them an effective group, to give them a shared purpose and a shared vision, which is an important quality of leadership. And what this tells us is that Kenji didn't really lose that until his dreams of being a musician fell apart. And Haru always felt bad for betraying Kenji and leaving him for another band. So this is a great integration of Kenji's history, and it's clearly one that's been a long time coming. We first heard of this drummer earlier on, and then again, Harunamio was introduced as the enka singer who sang the Hello Hello Expo song. So clearly Harunamio is a man of many talents, for starters, but he has clearly also been very influenced by Kenji. He bought into Kenji and his principles and his vision of the world, which was a world that was defined by rock and roll, to be perfectly honest. And Harunamio, while he's now an enka singer, well, he is kind of sold out, just like Kenji did when he decided to take over the family business. He still dreams of that world defined by rock and roll, and that's very important. Because, well, more on that later. Anyways, after the Namio reveal, we get the build up to our friend's final plan. We come back to Kyoko Koizumi, and it turns out that one of her friends has been having issues with her boyfriend. They go to check in on him, and it turns out that he's died of the blood virus. I don't know if they ever give this disease a formal name, but outbreaks are now taking place all over the world. And this clearly is the final act of the FDP's plan. Then we cut to something else. From this very grim moment, we go to talk about frogs. You may remember that at the very beginning of this story, the big story around Kenji's shopping district was that Kero was getting married. He was one of their friends. We saw him in several flashbacks. He had a frog face. He was the ruler of Frogadoom, the evil empire that they always fought against. He was always kind of at odds with Kenji when they were playing games, but Kero was a pretty good guy. He had a bright outlook on life. He had just gotten married. He was very optimistic about the future. And, when you see Revenge of Frog Doom Part 1, you think, oh, we're going back to Kero. We're going to find out what this happy-go-lucky guy has been up to. And we start with a shovel on the ground, kid dying under the desert sun. So maybe it won't be quite as happy and exciting as we had hoped for. But we find out what Kero has been up to all these years. He didn't show up when Kenji called for his friends. He ran away. In the United States now, he's been trying to turn his soba business into a successful food truck. He hasn't been doing very well. It's cost him a lot. He's divorced now. He has custody of his son, but his son is almost an adult, and he's thinking about going back to Japan. He misses his mother, even if Kero doesn't. But Kero is guilty. You can see it on his face. If you look at that face, that is not the face of a happy man. That is a face of a burdened man. And as always, I am impressed with Urasawa's ability to show us that kind of emotion so simply. There's not a whole lot of lines in most of his faces, and yet, yeah, that man is bothered by something. And when they find the kid, because of course they're going to find the kid, find the kid passed out. His son brings him to his dad, and we learn some important things about Kero. We've only really gotten to know him as a child when he was very rambunctious. Now he's in his mid-50s. He has an 18-year-old son. And when the kid tells him that his dad, the child's dad, takes all of his money so he can drink, well, we've already seen that face once. Kero is not happy. But very quickly, we find out that the kid's dad is dead, and not just him. Everyone in the town's dead. There's been an outbreak of the plague here, just like in Tokyo, and kid was one of the only ones to survive because he got a shot from a strange lady traveling through town, an Asian-looking lady, very pretty, who was trying to find test subjects for a medicine she was working on. She was offering people money, so of course this kid's dad, he'd get money any way he could. So kid took the shot. Dad took the $150. It did better. He lived when everyone else died. And of course, we suspect right away that the doctor who gave the kid the vaccine was Endo Kiriko, but we know for sure when we're told that it reminded the lady of her brother because they first met, he was playing a broom guitar. He always wanted to own a guitar and, maybe play a few rock songs. And his dad didn't have any modern music, so he only had old songs to listen to. So when they met, he was playing 20th Century Boy. Great use of the lore of the story right there. And it's enough for Kero to know who the woman is as well. He asks if she ever mentioned her brother's name, just to be sure. She did. It's Kenji, of course. So, Kero decides he has to make good. He says, get in the van, kid. We're going to find this lady. going to save the world. The ability to write these moments where small characters come back and make good like this is 20th Century Boys. That is the heart and soul of this story. We see so many small people who have sold out things they hoped for in order to stay alive in the world. And when they realize the world is going to be yanked out from under them, say, okay, all those compromises are in the past. We're going to do what we need to do. This is one of the best character introductions of 20th Century Boys. It's short, it's effective, and it's very powerful. We have another one in the very next chapter, which is called The Quiet Town in Germany, which is exactly what it says on the tin. There are places, as I said, all over the world where these outbreaks have taken place, and everyone is showing a few symptoms. And we see Herr Pops right here and his friend Peter picking through a raided supermarket because they've been locked down. They've been quarantined. They're not allowed, no one is allowed in or out of this town. So food is scarce. People are very worried. And this just shows us the human consequences of what the FDP is doing. And it shows us in a way that makes it very clear that these stakes apply to everyone, because they could have just shown us the situation in Japan. Urasawa wanted to make it clear that the FDP was working everywhere in the world to do this, and that everywhere in the world was equally under threat. So we have this, one chapter that's devoted to a small town in Germany who is also dealing with the plague. And we get a hint as to where salvation will come from. Turns out Kiriko was here as well, and she was taken care of by Herr Pops and his wife, and she left them a dose of her vaccine. Only had one, though, because she can't find any place that will mass manufacture it, and Herr Pops has to decide what to do with it. He offers it to his wife, but she turns him down and says that he should use it. Then, as they're going to bed that night, says, I met Peter in town. I think we should give the vaccine to him. And his wife says, that's a wonderful idea. Let's do that. Again, we see these small people in small ways fighting to save the world. Good stuff. Good stuff. But not everything is happy. We see riots breaking out in Japan. People are scared. They're panicked. They're locked down in quarantine. And it's not a good situation. It's not good. Someone has to do something. And we know who that is in this situation, of course. It's our 20th Century Boys. Of course, the story, where we left it off anyways, was Kyomi and her friend finding the body of one of the first victims. We pretty much pick up back there. They piece together, who it was who had started this. And there's a brief sequence where, this really just a rando, one of the dead man's roommates shows up and runs them out of their place. But Yoshitsune is on top of it. He's apparently been monitoring Kyomi's communications because he knows about all this, and he sends someone to pick them all up. And this installment of the story pretty much ends with Yoshitsune doling out rolls to everyone and getting ready to play the next hand against the FDP. And we are left on the notion that Kyomi and Kana have to go back into the VR game at Tomodachi Land so they can try and figure out something about our friend's past. Obviously, they can't rely on him to tell them anything anymore because he's dead. And anyone who has doubts in the inner circle of the FDP, well, they're gone. They've been purged. We see several of the purges on the news through the course of the 12 chapters in the first half of this volume. So, this is their last chance to learn things. And we are, as I have said, on our way to the climax of the second act of the story. In fact, we're pretty much there. It's coming very quickly. And this is, I think, a great set of character introductions here. Pops, we'll see a little more of him. Kero, we're really just learning who this guy is. Already had a really strong introduction. We're learning a little bit more about Yamane and Kiriko, people who we, again, really haven't known a whole lot about, although they've been in the story and named, and we've seen their faces repeatedly. We haven't known anything about them. So we're learning more about them as well. Urasawa is setting up all the threads for his final play that we will see play out in the third act. But right now, we just have to finish the second act, and that is very much what we're going to look at through the second half of this volume and the entirety of the next volume. So, pretty good stuff. Really great character work. The plot work, like I said, there are a couple of question marks here, and our story really doesn't go anywhere in the first half of this volume. But that's okay, because you do have to have these moments of downtime, and we just had a huge revelation when we learned who our friend was. So, I'll allow it. We really do need some character work at this point. We need some a little breathing space so people can collect themselves for the next push. We've had it. Now things hit the fan. Anyway, we'll talk about that more some other time. That's all I've got for you today. You can leave a like and a subscribe down below. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will talk to you later.